Even though World War II began in Europe in 1939, it would take until 1941 for the United States to be involved in the conflict. That's because the United States exercised neutrality, which was something they did so many times before in its history. During the 1920s, you have the Washington Naval Conference, which limited the amount of boats that certain countries could have in their navy, and you have the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which got rid of war as a foreign policy choice. Still, the United States saw the writing on the wall, and they wanted to firm up their friendships in the area. That's why you have the Good Neighbor policy with Latin America. In addition, you have several neutrality acts passed by Congress, 1935, 1937, and 1939. The one in 1939 had a cash and carry program. That said, if a nation wanted weapons, they can come here, pay in cash, and go carry them away. That tries to prevent what happened to the Lusitania. As we know, it was sunk by a German U-boat because it had weapons on it. In 1940, President Roosevelt traded destroyers for bases in the Caribbean. He didn't want to give anything away to question our neutrality. Roosevelt also gave the quarantine speech in 1937 where he said that we should quarantine aggressive nations. He doesn't name Germany and Japan, but that's who he's talking about. In 1941, the United States went one step further to equipping European nations by passing the Lend-Lease Act. That gave $50 billion in aid worth of material to the Allies. The United States was also getting prepared for war. For the first time ever, we have a peacetime draft in 1940. On December 7, 1941, Japan sneak attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 2,300 Americans were killed, many aboard the USS Arizona. The Japanese were upset over an oil embargo. FDR would give his famous Day of Infamy speech to Congress, and Congress would declare war. However, the United States would have to fight a two-front war, one in Europe and one in the Pacific. The United States would open up a second front in Europe with the biggest day of fighting in Europe. It's called D-Day, and it happened on June 6, 1944. The Allies were led by General Eisenhower. After opening up France, the United States would push on through and get the Germans to retreat back to their borders. However, the Germans would push back at the Battle of the Bulge. That would see some of the most terrible fighting in Europe and was the deadliest battle in Europe for the United States. However, the United States was able to overcome that battle and push Germany back once and for all. Adolf Hitler committed suicide in an underground bunker, and VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, would be declared in 1945. However, there was still fighting to be done in the Pacific. Here, we have a strategy of island hopping. This is where the Americans jump from island to island, from Midway to Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and eventually they got close to Japan. However, the question became, should the United States invade Japan? Harry Truman was then the president after FDR died in 1945. Truman decided to drop the bomb, the atomic bomb, on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Afterwards, Japan would have the unconditional surrender. The thought was that more people would die in an invasion than would with the bomb. Of course, the dropping of the atomic bomb would set forth an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Speaking of the Soviet Union, we have three conferences that you need to know about. You have the Tehran Conference, Yalta, and Potsdam Conference, where there's communication between the United States and its allies. You need to know about Yalta. In Yalta, that's where the Soviet Union would receive all of the former Nazi lands in Eastern Europe. These countries will eventually become satellites. Many historians consider Yalta to be the beginning of the Cold War. You need to know about the American home front during the war. Rosie the Riveter, or women, took the jobs from men as they went overseas. In addition, you have a lot of rationing going on where people are holding back on the amount of meat and gasoline they can consume. Victory gardens were planted as people took matters into their own hands when at home in terms of agriculture. Native Americans left the reservations to help out with the work. In addition, you have many going overseas as code talkers. Nobody ever broke the American code during the war. That's because our code talkers were speaking Navajo. Navajo did not exist in Japan or in Germany. Unions agreed to stop striking and manufacturing boomed. Many historians consider World War II as the reason why the United States got out of the Great Depression. However, all was not great on the home front. Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps after Executive Order 9066 turned the West Coast into a military zone. About 120,000 Japanese Americans would be relocated at this time. The Supreme Court case of Korematsu versus the U.S. said that the internment was legal, and in a time of war, civil liberties could be limited. There was also racial anxiety on the West Coast, as Mexican Americans were targeted in the Zoot Suit riots. This is where Mexican Americans were wearing traditional zoot suits, and some army men didn't like it, and it led to a riot. The police and the authorities looked the other way. Still, Mexican Americans could help out, as many served. In addition, you have the Bracero program, which helped migrant farm workers come into the country to work the farms. By the end of the war, the United States had spent $288 billion and had lost roughly 400,000 soldiers. After the war, the United States government tried to help the former soldiers acclimate to society. They passed the GI Bill, which gave out fair home loans as well as free college and vocational training to the former soldiers. These men came back and they saw their old girlfriends, and here came the baby boom. That's right, many babies were born at this time, which led to an increase in consumerism. A lot of these soldiers and their wives moved to suburbs. Places such as Levittown started to open up outside of cities. A way to get from the cities to the suburbs was the highway, as you get the Interstate Highway Act under President Eisenhower. However, the houses looked the same, and the jobs looked the same, and the cars looked the same, and these soldiers got stuck in a time period known for conformity. Women at the time barely worked at all outside of the home. Many of them returned to the home and to take care of the babies from the baby boom. Not everybody loved this new environment. You have a group of people called the beatniks, or the Beat Generation. Writers like Jack Kerouac, who wrote On the Road. They wanted to experiment with drugs and sex, and they did not want the conformity of the 1950s. Also going against conformity is a new form of entertainment called rock and roll that you could see the roots in jazz and earlier types of music. After the war, there's also a lot of internal migration going on as people start to move to the South, to places such as Florida and Texas and Arizona. This area is called the Sun Belt, and it continues to grow today. Workers' rights were hurt because of the Taft-Hartley Act. That got rid of the closed shop that said that a person had to be in a union to work a certain job. It was passed over President Harry Truman's veto. World War II is going to lead to a lot of foreign policy changes. In 1941, Churchill met Roosevelt for the Atlantic Charter. As part of that charter, they decided that there should be an international peacekeeping organization to keep peace after the war. Similar to the League of Nations, you now have the creation of the United Nations, which would be more powerful because it would have a military. Also, the United States would join the United Nations and become one of the 5 permanent nations. At this time also, you have the rise of communism in China under Mao Zedong. Also, Germany gets divided. West Germany is controlled by the Allies, and East Germany is controlled by the Soviets. After the war, there's a series of trials. The Nuremberg trials punished Nazis for the Holocaust, and the Tokyo trials punished the Japanese for their harsh treatment of prisoners of war. It was clear that after World War II, nobody wanted World War III. Eleanor Roosevelt helped to write up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that talked about the importance of freedom and equality, and also talked about how there should be no torture and slavery. World War II was a dramatic change for the United States, both internally and abroad. However, there would be a new war to be fought, one between the 2 superpowers that emerged out of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States, and this would become the Cold War.